The recordings are going to be available through the center's website, so we can revisit all these conversations that we are having with our guests. So good evening, everyone. I welcome you to this, the last session of the CLAS Open Seminar, this very awkward and challenging term that has put tremendous pressure on students as well as on the academic and administrative staff. So I want to thank the students for their patience, for their resilience, for the hard work all this term, in spite of all the challenging circumstances, attending lectures and seminars. The academic staff, I think, that has done a tremendous effort to maintain a high level of teaching, organizing lectures remotely. And I must thank Julie and Christelia for their amazing support, making the term go by as if nothing were happening. So thank you very much to all of you, really. And I have to tell you that usually we don't have seminars in the Easter term, but we are organizing a few seminars in the Easter term just to create an opportunity for us to meet during the term and continue these conversations in the next term. So there is a chance to get together in spite of the circumstances, I think. Also today is International Women's Day. And this year, I think it has a particular significance given the impact, which has seen the impact of the pandemic that has seen women, more women than men lose their jobs, get furloughed, and of course carrying the burden of homeschooling, not only in this country, but around the world. And it's also to remind ourselves, I guess, of the persistence of pay gaps, and in our academic context, the absence of women at professorial level. So from the Center of Latin American Studies, we challenge and call out gender inequality and gender bias. So anyway, but today, so we introduced Dr. Rachel Sieder, profesora investigadora, titular del Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios Superiores en Antropología en México. She is editor of the Handbook of Law and Society in Latin America with Routledge, and author of Acceso a la Justicia para Mujeres Indígenas en Guatemala, Casos Paradigmáticos, Estrategias de Judicialización y Jurisprudencia Emergente. She's also project manager of a project entitled Pluriland, Theorizing Conflict and Contestation in Plural Land Rights Regimes. This is a project sponsored by the Norwegian Research Council. The talk today, however, is product of another project entitled The Juridification of Resource Conflicts, Legal Cultures, Moralities, and Environmental Politics in Central America. It's a project that looks at the way in which legal systems are deployed by different actors in order to advance their views and claim ownership of subsoil resources, especially minerals and water, in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. The title of her presentation today is The Juridification of Indigenous Struggles, the long arc of the Marlin mine in Guatemala. Rachel, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for sharing your work with us. So please, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Felipe. And well, it's great to see faces that I know and new faces here. And I was going to say, it's great to be back in Cambridge, but it's a strange way to be back in Cambridge on Zoom. But I'm very grateful for the invitation. And I'd really like, well, to thank Felipe Hernandez, class director, and I'd like to thank Julie Coimbra and Sarah Radcliffe, who unfortunately can't be here today, for the invitation. What I'm going to present to you is a work in progress, and it forms part of this broader project that Felipe mentioned on the juridification of socio-environmental conflicts in Central America and Mexico. which is led by Dr. Ainhoa Montoya, who's at the School of Advanced Studies in London. And then there's myself and Jacob Simbravo here at CIESAS, and it's a British Academy funded project. And what I'm going to talk about today, the Marlin mine, is a paradigmatic case of long-run, multi-scalar juridification of a socio-environmental conflict. And it was often framed as one of the most emblematic cases of indigenous resistance to mega projects, mining mega projects in Latin America. And what I want to reflect on here, on that process, is to kind of try and think through what it signals about the relationship between indigenous peoples' demands for justice and law and international law. And I do this from my position as a researcher allied with the struggles of indigenous peoples against the multiple forms of violence and dispossession that they face, underscored by colonial logics. And I hope that these reflections today are going to be a contribution to some of those struggles. So if I can share my screen, let me see if I can get back to the beginning. Hang on. Share screen. Okay. Good. Can everyone see this screen? Great. Okay, I'm going to start with a story. Early one morning in October 2019, I arrived at the offices of the Community Health Association, ASECSA, in Chimaltenango in Guatemala, together with 3 colleagues of mine who are lawyers from the Association of Mayan Notaries and Lawyers in Guatemala. And the aim of the meeting was to explore what support the lawyers and me might be able to lend to the Consejo Maya Mam Sipacapense, which is an organization representing villagers from the municipality of Sipacapa, who for many years had opposed, excuse me, the Marlin mine. We sat around a large square of tables as staff members from ASECSA filed into the meeting, together with a group of tired-looking men in boots and jackets carrying woven bags or morales, who introduced themselves as members of the Consejo Maya Sipacapense. Marlin was the second largest open pit gold mine in Latin America. It began operating in 2004 in the contiguous municipalities of San Miguel Ixtahuacan and Sipacapa in the department of San Marcos. It ceased operations in May 2017, and in 2019 closed for good, leaving behind a landscape of environmental destruction and bitter intercommunal divisions. The team at ASECSA had been accompanying the communities grouped together in the Consejo Sipacapense to discuss what actions might be taken around the closure of the mine. A mesa de diálogo, a space for discussion, had previously been set up by ASECSA and other social organizations that had accompanied the villagers of both municipalities to develop an alternative closure plan, or Plan de Cierre, with the aim of presenting demands for compensation for environmental and social damages to the Guatemalan state authorities. However, long-standing divisions between the 2 main organizations representing the affected communities, the Consejo Maya Mam Sipacapense, and the other, the Frente de Defensa Miguelense, or FREDEMI, of San Miguel Ixtahuacan, had led the former to withdraw from the mesa. So the future of this participatory closure plan was, at that moment in time, very uncertain. And the meeting that I attended that morning in October of 2019 was just one of literally hundreds that these community activists had participated in over the course of nearly 2 decades in their efforts to stop the mine and confront its effects on their lives. Over the years, an impressive array of actors and networks had lent their support to the campaign against Marlin, including national and international NGOs and development cooperation agencies, the local diocese of the Catholic Church, transnational anti-mining coalitions, local and foreign academics, and numerous collectives and organizations dedicated to so-called strategic litigation in defense of the collective rights of Indigenous peoples. Yet despite years of protest and a plethora of legal actions, prospects for any form of redress, much less justice, for the inhabitants of San Miguel and Sipacapa appeared to be more distant than ever now that the mining company had left. And in previous months, congressional representatives from minority opposition parties, WINAC in particular, had tried to present legal initiatives against government ministers, alleging that they'd failed in their duty to guarantee an orderly process of mine closure defined by clear technical specifications. There were also sympathetic lawyers with an environmental brief at the government Human Rights Ombudsman's office who were trying to monitor violations of rights to water and health and the collective rights of Indigenous peoples involved in the mine's closure. But the government just wouldn't give them information, and they routinely had to try and get information by presenting public access requests. Academics and civil society organizations had documented extensively ongoing damages to subsoil water resources and to the houses of villagers in the mine's vicinity over many years. But despite that, no charges for environmental contamination or damage had ever successfully been brought against Montana Exploradora de Guatemala, which was the local subsidiary of Canadian-based multinational mining company Glamis Gold, which later became Goldcorp Inc., which assumed the concession in 2009. One of my Mayan lawyer friends patiently explained to me that the burden of proof was simply too high in a criminal case, and that Guatemala's existing environmental regulation offered no clear route for litigation, much less against a powerful multinational company. Now the mine had closed, and it was even harder to demonstrate conclusively that water sources had been contaminated by its operations, or that the infertility of agricultural lands that had driven more and more villagers to migrate away from the area was in any way related to the mega mining project. So to talk a bit about the juridification of protests against the mine. As we know, since the codification of Indigenous peoples as collective subjects of law with specific rights began in Latin America in the 1980s, social and political mobilization to defend land and water resources in the face of the region-wide extractives boom occurred in tandem with a turn to the law. And what I want to do here is consider the possibilities and limits of judicial and quasi-judicial strategies as responses to the multiple grievances involved in mega mining on Indigenous peoples' historic lands. The long arc of juridification surrounding the Marlin project stretches from an initial emphasis on the lack of adequate consultation of Indigenous villagers about the approval of the licenses to mine to Montana Exploradora, through the systematic criminalization of community activists opposed to the mine, to latterly efforts to hold the government accountable for its failure to ensure villagers' rights to environmental protection during its closure. In more than 2 decades since the original license to explore and exploit silver and gold through open pit mining was issued by Guatemala's Ministry of Energy and Mines in 1996, legal actions were initiated by affected communities, local lawyers, and national NGOs before the domestic courts. Cases were taken before the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. I'll talk about that in a bit. Also before the World Bank's Compliance Advisory Ombudsman. The mine site was visited by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, who subsequently issued a series of recommendations to the Guatemalan government, including the order to cease operations of the mine until the question of prior consultation was satisfactorily resolved. Complaints were also brought to the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, CICIG, about corruption and kickbacks involved in the granting of the original license to exploit gold and silver. And activists in Canada and Guatemala continue to this day to explore the possibilities of bringing legal actions against the Canadian government in that country's domestic courts because of the fact that the Marlin project effectively overrode the Canadian government's own guidelines for guaranteeing Indigenous people's rights. If I can show you, let me see if this works. Just a list here of the legal actions. There we go. I couldn't, for some reason, make it into a slide on the PowerPoint, and it's in Spanish, and I'm not going to go through it, but just to give you an idea of the multiple legal actions that this case involved. From 2005, you can see actions before the World Bank, before the Constitutional Court of Guatemala, the Inter-American Commission, more cases brought before the Guatemalan Constitutional Court, criminal actions brought against members of the company, legal actions brought against the mayors of Ixtahuacan, and so it goes to the CICIG. So if anybody's interested in the detail on this, I will happily send you the table, but I just wanted to put it up there just so that you have a sense of just how many legal actions and quasi-legal actions were taken around this case. Okay, let me get the other. So, as I signaled at the beginning of the presentation, Marlin was a paradigmatic case of long-run, multi-scalar juridification of socio-environmental conflict. And move it on. I want to say something about processes of juridification, which, as I've written about in other places, are characterized by this imbrication of legal mechanisms and rights imaginaries and political claiming. Juridification can involve judicialization. That's when political battles are displaced to the courts. But in fact, evidence is a much broader phenomenon involving forms of political subjectivity that are intimately bound up with shifting legal frames and fluid, constantly changing networks of actors involved in different ways with multiple forms of law. So legal framings, when people start to think of themselves as subjects of rights or collective subjects of rights, would be one example. Juridification also refers to processes of legal or law-like ordering, wherein courts or other agents, such as NGOs or international organizations, will demand certain standards of legibility and documentation from subjects. So these kind of juridified multi-actor interactions often end up being quite central in determining what comes to count as authoritative forms of knowledge and evidence, and therefore they're important sites of consultation. And some of the applied work that I do is as a special anthropological witness for court cases of this sort. And obviously this question of evidence and what counts as evidence becomes particularly acute when the disputed evidence in question refers to measures of environmental and social harm. And the last point that's up on the slide about global legal pluralism is that these processes of juridification, it's not just judicialization, which tends to be before the domestic courts, but juridification processes have this multi-scalar overlapping quality because there are actions going on and connecting with each other at many different scales. Writing about mining conflicts in Peru, Fabiana Lee uses the concept of equivalence to examine how solutions to socio-environmental conflicts are conceptualized and to explore the underlying tensions that are involved. And as you read from the slide, she says here, the term equivalence is intended to capture two related processes. First, equivalence refers to forms of expertise and technical tools used to make things quantifiable and comparable. And second, equivalence is a political relationship that involves constant negotiation over what counts as authoritative knowledge. While Lee in her wonderful book does not focus specifically on anti-mining litigation, I think her concept of equivalence can be extended to the jural. As has often been observed, law operates as a neoliberal technology of standardization to ensure commensurability and to establish comparable understandings and measures of damage and compensation in these kinds of cases. At almost every scale, just about all of the legal and administrative actions undertaken against the Marlin mine invoked the figure of free, prior, and informed consultation, or free, prior, and informed consultation for consent. Free, prior, and informed consultation being the right famously granted to Indigenous peoples by International Labour Organization's Convention 169. And that has been really at the heart of socio-legal initiatives to contest extractive industries affecting Indigenous peoples across Latin America. As Mariana Valverde has observed, and I quote her, legal discourse and judicial discourse in particular readily admits that it is in the business of generating words that have the special status of assigning value and meaning to utterances that are not in themselves judicial or legal, close quote. And talking about consulta or consultation, there's an awful lot of work on consultation in Latin America. But one of the authors I find particularly helpful on this is César Rodríguez Garavito from Colombia. And he's noted in his work on consultation processes in Colombia that legal artifacts, including laws or with their procedural times and sequences, and the fiction of equality that they provide between the parts in any legal dispute, tend to generate an illusion of order and predictability in what are often contexts of ongoing systematic violence. So Rodríguez Garavito understands the figure of consulta, or consultation, as a kind of lengua franca, which is focused on the procedural and that permits effectively the interaction of a very diverse range of actors, including Indigenous peoples' movements and governments, international organizations and multinational companies. And this is in turn part of a wider global paradigm of legally plural neoliberal governance, which is grounded in hard and soft law, and that invokes the collective rights of Indigenous peoples that are associated with late 20th century multicultural paradigms to govern difference. Those opposing the Marlin mine certainly did invoke the figure of consultation, both in the wave of community consultations that took place in the mid to late 2000s. And there were more than 1 million people took part in these community consultations over mining and mega projects in the 2000s in Guatemala. And in all of that list of legal actions that I put up briefly, it was also the figure of consultation and the lack of free, prior and informed consultation was also put forward by legal activist networks. But despite the language of these multiple legal dispositions, I think villagers' demands were less about ensuring administrative processes of consultation between the company and villagers overseen by the government, which is essentially what the promise of the legal figure of prior consultation is about. And what I want to argue presently is that those demands were more centered on continuums of racialized colonial violence and their effects. To continue with the theme of rights and equivalences, I want to talk just very briefly about the case that was taken before the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. In December 2007, the Guatemalan NGO Plurijur, Asociación Pluriculturalidad Jurídica de Guatemala, which is led by the lawyer Carlos Luarca, took a case against the Guatemalan state to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, alleging that it had violated rights to prior consultation of indigenous villagers of San Miguel Ixtahuacan by issuing the license for the Marlin mine. In May 2010, the Commission found in the plaintiff's favor and issued precautionary measures, which called for a halt to mining operations at Marlin until the issue of consultation was satisfactorily resolved. The Commission also ordered the government to provide potable water to 18 of the affected communities who had put forward the petition. So this was initially celebrated as a great victory for transnational litigation, but the effects of this process of judicialization were complex. Not only did the Inter-American Commission fail to address all the violations of human rights that had been presented by the plaintiffs, but in an exercise of commensurability, or in Lee's term, equivalence, it effectively established a single form of remedy, potable water, in response to what it determined was the violation of the human right to water. So mining operations were temporarily halted in 2010, but in 2011, the following year, the Commission modified the precautionary measures that it had previously adopted in response to a petition by the Governmental Presidential Commission on Human Rights, which had requested that those precautionary measures be declared without further effect. And the government's petition was based on the findings of an administrative process that's specified by Guatemala's mining law, and that had deemed that, and I cite it, no proof exists that there is any situation presenting a threat of serious or imminent harm to persons of, or that there is a probability that any damage will materialize. Therefore, there does not exist a situation of extreme precarious seriousness or urgency to avoid irreparable harm to persons as a result of operations at the Marlin mine, close quote. So the Inter-American Commission modified the precautionary measures and reduced them to effectively requesting only that the government ensure the quality of water sources serving the 18 communities identified in the petition as suitable for drinking, domestic, irrigation uses, and that it had to keep updating the Commission as to how it was fulfilling this duty. By 2019, the time that we were at the meeting that I described at the outset of the talk, the government assured everybody that it had complied with the Commission's requirements, but special requests for information in Congress and elsewhere revealed that although preliminary studies had been carried out, there was still no drinking water in all of the communities in question. The legal formalisms and technicalities involved in the multiple judicialization initiatives that I'm speaking about appeared to be quite distant a few years earlier in July 2012, when I had participated as a judge in an International People's Health Tribunal in San Miguel Ixtahuacan. As part of a group of activists and academics from across Latin America, invited for our expertise in health, environment, and human rights, our brief was essentially to put Goldcorp on trial. In preparation for the task ahead, we were sent a plethora of UN conventions, covenants, and declarations on the right to health. And the road trip to San Miguel from Guatemala City was long, and we arrived late in the afternoon, later than we were supposed to arrive. And straight away, we were ushered into a room where some 400 people were waiting for us. The tables we were motioned to sit at were arranged, as you can see, in a hemisphere in the middle of the room. Behind us were assembled Mayan villagers, activists, international accompaniers, and on the floor in front of us was an ofrenda of flowers, fruit, and candles. Crisanta Perez, who's one of the most prominent Maya Mam women activists who had mobilized in opposition to the mine, was the first to take the microphone, affirming that the purpose of the event was so that those present could expresar nuestros sentimientos, lo que nos duele, to express our feelings, the things that cause us pain. Her comments seemed to collapse the Spanish conquest and Guatemala's genocidal armed conflict of the 1980s, linking them to the battle against the Marlin mine. She said, es libertad para los ricos y poderosos. Para nosotros sigue la guerra todavía. Ninguno de nuestros gobiernos nos defiende como personas, como pueblos, como seres humanos que somos. So there's freedom for the rich and the powerful. For us, the war continues. None of our governments defend us as people, as peoples, or as the human beings that we are. Over the course of 2 days, we listened to the testimonies of those affected by the company's mining operations in Carrizalillo, in Guerrero, in Guatemala, in the Sieder Valley in Francisco Morazán in Honduras, and in San Miguel and Zipacapa in San Marcos, Guatemala, all of these places where Goldcorp had mining operations. People spoke about skin and eye illnesses, hair loss, skin rashes, miscarriages, infertility, premature births, birth defects and death of newborns, joint pains, auditory damage, gastrointestinal problems, nervous afflictions, and cases of poisoning that had led to death. As one woman said, lo que más me mortifica son los niños, siempre andan con gripe y calentura, uno se desespera, no hay medicinas en el pueblo. So what mortifies me most are the children. They've always got fever and flu, and it's just a desperate situation because there are no medicines in the village. We heard from ex-workers of Goldcorp whose health had been affected by frequent intoxication, leaks, toxic chemical explosions, and workplace accidents due to a lack of equipment and security measures. People also spoke about an unmitigated increase in bars, alcoholism, drug addiction, and gender violence, with the appearance of prostitution, venereal disease, and HIV/AIDS in their communities in the wake of Goldcorp's mining projects. We heard stories of trauma, depression, and loss linked to the climate of fear, impotence, and insecurity surrounding the mines, and learned that divisions and conflicts within communities and even families have been profoundly aggravated as intracommunal tensions, mistrust, and violence increased. Mayan women activists from the village of Achel gave personal testimony about their criminalization by the Guatemalan state, involving arrest, detention, surveillance, and threats. In 2008, 8 women were subject to arrest warrants issued against them for charges linked to cutting off power lines leading to the mine. And the warrants had been issued after one particular woman, Gregoria Crisanta Perez Pamaca, had argued, and she cut the power lines and argued that the posts that carried the electricity to the mine had been installed on her property without her consent or any legal authority. And the campaign of defamation against the women had been particularly insidious, with rumors spread that they'd been sexually assaulted by security guards at the mine. Some witnesses spoke of violent threats and assassination attempts, which they attributed to groups in the community allied with Montana Exploradora. And many expressed a real loss of confidence in their local authorities and just a general feeling of betrayal. In repeated testimonies, we heard the ways in which people felt stigmatized, marginalized, and criminalized for questioning mining operations in their territory. I am a despised person just because we defend the life we all deserve. Teodora Hernandez wept as she told us about the pressure she'd faced to sell her land to the mine and the racialized forms of discrimination that this had involved. She han dicho porque ando con cortes sucios o rotos, pero es porque yo trabajo y no vendo mi terreno a ninguno, yo no vendo mi terreno. So they have said that because I have traditional dress and it's dirty, or because I'm poor, but it's because I work and I'm not going to sell my land to anybody. I don't sell my land. It was quite overwhelming to have days listening to this testimony, and I have thought much about it over the years and gone back over and over again on my notes from that time. And I think that taken together, these narratives spoke of continuums of racialized colonial violence, and certainly about the imposition of an ideology of progress and development against a construction of the backwards and worthless. One woman said, my sisters told me that I was worthless. I was worth nothing. Que no valía nada yo. Dijeron la mina es desarrollo. They said the mine is development. On the last day, we, the group of judges or experts, retreated to a back room to write our judgment, which I was nominated to read to the assembled public and cameras. We made a concerted effort to recover and validate the expressions of grievances that we had listened to over the 2 days of hearing, and we delivered a guilty verdict to Gold Court, to the host countries of Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico, as well as the Canadian government for supporting and promoting in various ways irresponsible mining investments in Mesoamerica. So to wrap up and tie these different elements together, what I've tried to suggest here is that over the long arc of juridification around the Marlin mine, consulta or consultation operated both as a political imaginary, encapsulating the idea that local grievances, demands, and understandings should or could be taken into account on the one hand, and on the other, consulta operates as a transnational technique of commensurability and standardization through law, which could never satisfy Mayan communities' demands for voice, dignity, and redress, much less recognize the grievances and alternative epistemologies and ontologies that informed their protests against the mine. Even in countries such as Bolivia, Colombia, or Canada, where extensive processes of consultation with Indigenous and Native peoples have been carried out and guaranteed by governments through different legislative and administrative measures, results have been uneven, and Indigenous peoples' sovereign rights to land and resources have generally not been recognized. As a wealth of comparative literature in Latin America has suggested, after 2 decades, it's increasingly clear that although the legal and administrative frameworks of free, prior, and informed consultation have been a conduit for protest and juridification, and when the courts find in the plaintiff's favor, they have achieved a temporary halt to some mega projects, but they've also been used to manage resistance and to displace claims for self-determination. Still, the inherent ambiguities and disputes surrounding the interpretation of consultation and consultation for consent, which is the soft law standard of the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, means that, having said all of these things, consulta continues to be deployed in multiple ways by those claiming greater territorial autonomy and different models of development. In Guatemala, colonial sovereignty continues to be violently asserted. Systematic criminalization of community leaders resisting mega projects has increased in the last decade, involving not only the routine use of judicial charges of terrorism, sedition, conspiracy, illegal detention or kidnapping, threats, instigation to commit criminal acts, and even threats to national security and the security of public services, but also we see defamatory media campaigns, which have really been strengthened in recent years through targeted use of social media and net centers. And a lot of contemporary juridification now revolves around the defense of territorial defenders who are being criminalized in multiple forms. For example, as my colleague, mine lawyer Juvita Sul has shown, women community defenders who act as translators in legal cases where villagers are trying to defend their lands and water resources are increasingly targeted and systematically charged with criminal offenses such as threatening behavior, instigating criminal acts, or aggravated usurpation. So the lawfare of the governments and mining companies then involves fabricated charges, these media campaigns, and really efforts to tie up activists in court with never-ending criminal procedures until those people who've been detained are eventually released, which is often years later for lack of adequate proof. At the same time, I think there's a marked shift on the part of Mayan activists and lawyers involved in initiatives to resist extractive projects, to try and go beyond the administrative and political trap of consulta, and to instead try and frame arguments about long-run historical dispossession of indigenous lands, about territorial control, and the rights of indigenous peoples to legal and political autonomy. Such framings in defense of indigenous people's sovereignty over territory point, I think, to forms of juridification that are attempting to conceptualize long-run forms of harm, or in Rob Nixon's terms, slow violence, which many indigenous people conceptualize as genocidal colonial violence. My experience working with Mayan lawyers associations in Guatemala have made me reflect more deeply on the intersections between these processes of slow violence and the dynamics of juridification. The legacy of 2 decades of the Marlin mine is one of environmental damage, intracommunal and intra-organizational conflict, and the pernicious effects of criminalization. As the critical anthropological literature on transitional justice of recent years suggests, such damage, part of colonial continuums of harm, is arguably irreparable and unquantifiable, and not easily translated into legal or administrative measures. And I will wrap up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This would be the moment, Rachel, when we would be clapping. So we're all clapping at the moment. Thank you very much for this extraordinary, if discouraging talk. I think, I mean, it's an incredibly, I suppose, worrying situation that we hear across Latin America. You do speak about Colombia, Peru, Bolivia. We had a talk by Eduardo Gudinas about Peru, also and other parts of Latin America. We all have read Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui's denunciations. And the situation is extraordinary. It seems like the legal system, the juridification of this is also informed or continues to be informed by structural differences that cannot be eliminated from the law, from the legal system. And for that reason, it appears to be almost impossible to be able to overcome those colonial differences and the colonial violence. But anyway, I don't want to keep the conversation and instead open the floor for questions. And if you raise your hand on the hand little figure, I will say your name and invite you to ask your question. Are there any questions? Oh, yes, Emiliano, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Rachel, for the wonderful presentation. I was wondering if in your experience in these tribunals, you could attest or intuit any emerging forms of evidence that came up maybe informed by local cosmologies or simply by new visions of what constitutes forms of truth to incriminate a company or a state. I'm curious about that. Thank you.
Shall I answer now?
I think we can, and then there is a question by Michael in a minute.
Thanks, Emiliano, for your question. And yeah, it's one that I have been working on and thinking about a lot. And yes, is the short answer. And certainly, it's very difficult in cases of socio-environmental damage, right? And there's a kind of war of scientists that goes on, and often different experts are brought in by the companies and by the NGOs to provide special expert witness reports. But in terms of what I'm particularly interested in is kind of how through our work as anthropologists, we can through some of these special expert witness reports, which are not without their pitfalls, they're part of these complex juridification processes. But certainly I think what we can try and do is translate or communicate some of those alternative notions of damage, right? So for example, one of the things that the companies always say, right, this was a health tribunal, and you know, people are, I talked about the way in which people described how their health had been so impacted since the appearance of the mine. And the company will say, well, you know, there was no baseline health studies, and this is a poor, ill, you know, community anyway. And how do we know that these things are attributable to the mine or not? So it's a question of causality and proving causality that's always at issue in these cases, and so complex. But you know, people would talk, they talked a lot, women particularly talked a lot about the impact on their ability to provision for their families, right? So things that they had grown that now don't grow because the water was contaminated, or wildlife, right? So, you know, there are no birds around that mine site, or there weren't at that time. And people talked a lot about how it had affected animals and bird life, and those kinds of things are, you know, exactly the kind of alternative forms of evidence and understanding of people's relationships with the humans and non-humans that are part of their territory, but they're always disputed as evidence that is something that can be linked, cause, you know, that damage can be definitively linked to the presence of the mine. So, you know, really they're disputes over ways of understanding the world, and yeah, ways of understanding territory, but also ways of understanding history, right? So kind of what's the time frame that you're talking about for damage? And I think those things also are, you know, they're at the center of kind of debates about compensation, reparations, and environmental law, right? Are we talking about damage for this generation, future generations? So there are really complex issues about time and understandings of life and territory, and what one needs to continue to be able to live in a space. But we certainly heard those in the tribunal. And a lot of what I was trying to do around the participatory plan that hasn't come to fruition, the alternative plan, the Sieder, is about trying to see how we can communicate some of that damage as part of legal actions. But I'm not sure that that is actually going to be possible. We'll see.
Okay, we have a few more questions. Michael, were you raising your physical hand before? You're muted, Michael. We can't hear you.
Yes, I did. It's certainly because I didn't know how to use the other thing.
The other hand.
I wanted to ask a very short factual question, and then another slightly broader question. The first one is, you said at one point that water had been somehow restored, or and I wondered whether that was as sort of a process of compensation, or was it a sort of reparation? In other words, was it a quid pro quo, or was it in fact something that should have been there and that was being returned. The broader question is, as an anthropologist dealing against the, I mean, all legal systems or all juridic systems appear to be unwelcoming to the public and to the client, and to be rather naturally closed systems. But I was wondering whether this sort of experience allows you an insight into what is wrong with jurisprudence in Latin America, because this story of, you know, the individual being shortchanged by a whole set of legal institutions that close ranks against the individual unless he's got tons of money or tons of influence or something or other. This sort of natural, the French word is hérisson, I've forgotten how you say this in English, this closing of the animal against any good sense. Can you see where it occurs this occurs all over Latin America in all sorts of cases, not just in mining cases, but in all sorts of labor law, in health, everything. Right? Can you put your finger on where it's going wrong? I mean, what specific instruments allow a legal system to so malfunction?
Thank you for your questions, Michael. On the specific question of water, it was the appeal that was taken before the Commission, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and a whole range of grievances were set out, including damage to water, which of course is translated into violation of the right to water, which is part of the American Convention of Human Rights. And so what happened was, when the precautionary measures were modified, actually from the beginning, the Commission demanded that urged the Guatemalan government to provide potable water to these 18 communities, which they obviously didn't have potable water. So it's still been a long disputed process in terms of, you know, who puts the labor, because the communities are supposed to put free labor in to build the infrastructure, and who pays for what, but some of it has advanced. But so yes, I mean, effectively it's understood by the Commission as a form of redress for that violation. But it was narrow. I mean, the point I was trying to make was that, you know, people go to court to claim a whole range of things, and the law tends to narrow things down. And in this case, they narrowed it down to, you know, the form of redress is drinking water or potable water, where actually the claims have been much, much broader than that. In terms of the legal systems being unwelcoming to the public and closed, yes, I think I mean, actually, this is a kind of, I've told a not very uplifting story about juridification and going to court. But I mean, there are victories in court, and we do go to court a lot. Right? And in fact, you know, the indigenous movement in Latin America has probably been one of the ones that has had most successes relatively in the courts. And certainly, not just in Guatemala, but in Mexico here too, there are now more and more collectives of lawyers, indigenous lawyers, who are taking the cases out of strategic litigation for collective rights of indigenous peoples. So I don't know if it's kind of what's wrong with jurisprudence. I mean, we've certainly got better jurisprudence and more jurisprudence than we had 30 years ago. But, you know, all legal systems codify imbalances, huge asymmetries. I mean, the idea of villagers taking a multinational like Goldcorp, holding them to account through the courts, when, you know, despite having many really brave judges in Guatemala who do take seriously these petitions, on the whole, governments all over are in alliance with the companies. And the question that this is not development, or this is not the kind of form of development we might want, and people in those territories would want, is often just not entertained, because, and often it's because it doesn't fit into the technical, the legal specificities. So that's a rambling answer to your question, but I don't think it's an either or question. And obviously also, you know, these are political struggles, right? You often go to court not expecting that you're going to win the case, right? But the going to court may mean that you get further in winning the political battle. So the kind of balance between the politics and the legal dynamics of socio-legal mobilization, I think is kind of the thing to look at. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Rachel. We're going to take two questions because we have three hands up. So Ana Lucia and Carlos Fernando, please.
Thank you so much. I'm very interested in your experience, Rachel. I wanted to know what was the role of the company and of the government in this tribunal that you participated in? What were their perceptions, their narratives, and their participation overall?
Thank you, Ana Lucia. The government didn't participate at all in this. This was a civil society action. It's not a formal legal instancia. How do you say? Yes.
Yeah.
But more a form of political civil society action, but that mimicked a court, right? I mean, that was the super interesting thing about it. You know, we were all appointed as judges. We were all filed into this hemisphere. Everybody came and gave their testimony, and effectively, people had their day in court, right? They could speak their truth to power, but Gold Court wasn't there and the government wasn't there. The response to it, I'm not sure that there was a specific response to that tribunal as such, but certainly there was, there's a massive, extraordinarily well-funded campaign supported by the government and funded by Gold Court to try and convince everybody that mining is development. So on every bus shelter, there was, a poster for Gold Court saying "La mina es desarrollo," and jingles on the radio, etc. So it's narratives around development. I actually took part in something at Canning House recently, which was about the future of mining in Latin America, and representatives from companies and from different think tanks kind of rubbing their hands about the next mining boom in Latin America, because we're going to need so many batteries for electric cars that mining's going to be now even bigger. This was about Ecuador and Peru, but those narratives about development are really the things that are at issue and being disputed here. So obviously, a group of us going and doing something that community activists are filming and putting up on social media is part of that struggle about placing alternative narratives in the public sphere.
Thank you. Carlos?
Well, thank you very much. It's been incredibly interesting, your presentation, but at the same time, very frustrating in a way, because I don't see any muscle from international institutions, for instance, that they appear to be on the sidelines and not really taking any kind of direct action. And I don't know if you can sort of enlighten us a little bit more about the human rights element, for instance, that is quite important, not only for United Nations, but also for the Organization of American States. And the other thing that I wanted to point out was that what is happening with the very concept of development that we have more or less cherished, and we have encouraged this somewhat erroneous concept to be loved by God knows who. I mean, we are still planning our development in terms of attacking nature, attacking the Mother Earth. Pachamama has been suffering everywhere, and yet we seem to be somewhat using the very concept of development that has been more or less become obsolete by the results of this kind of development.
Thank you, Carlos. I'm sorry if it was a frustrating talk. Maybe it's expressing my frustration at many, many years of this. And I don't mean to say that international organizations are, on the sidelines and not doing anything in this, because that's not true. Obviously, the battery of human rights that we have, the fact that we now do have, collective rights of indigenous peoples enshrined in international law, that it's possible to go and dispute these things, that we have an extensive jurisprudence, an important jurisprudence from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights on indigenous peoples' rights to autonomy, land rights, rights to their own forms of law. I mean, those are terribly important elements. And for example, the special rapporteur on indigenous people's rights, that's also another extraordinarily important tool. In fact, the new special rapporteur, Francisco Calitzay, is Guatemalan lawyer. So no, I don't mean to say that they're not important, but in terms of muscle, I think we are, we're at a moment when the muscle of the international community is flabby or non-existent on so many rights violations. I mean, just watching the news about Myanmar this morning, or we could talk about the Syrian conflict or so many other conflicts where the muscle of the international human rights communities to actually stop violations is necessarily limited. Right? And I think we're in a different moment than we were 20 years ago, with the kind of hope that was opened up by the multicultural or plurinational constitutions. And it's a much darker place in many ways than it was 20 years ago. On the broader question of this of development, yes, but I mean, I don't think it's just indigenous peoples organizations that are questioning narratives of development built on never-ending extraction and never-ending growth, economic growth. I mean, there's lots of organizations, lots of economists talking about zero growth. Obviously the need to leave fossil fuels in the ground. So I think that many of the things that either as environmental campaigners or as campaigners for indigenous rights we were talking about in terms of alternative visions of development 20 years ago are now kind of part of mainstream discourse. So, which is not to say that that's being adopted, of course, by those that have, power and money. This is a huge challenge in the pandemic at the moment, the extent to which, governments' recovery plans are actually green recovery plans or not, not as the case may be, for example, here in Mexico, which is still very much wedded to a fossil fuel driven vision of development. So I think that, the question of what forms of development can the earth sustain, which will cease, will reduce the pace of species extinction, that's obviously the fundamental question of our time, and it's one that one sees important alliances between young environmental campaigners and indigenous peoples organizations, and a whole generation of young indigenous peoples working on climate change. So that's one of the hopeful things for me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. David, you had your hand up, but you've taken it down. Do you still have a question?
Yeah, I had several. I mean, this is, you haven't yourself been in danger in all this?
Not so far as I know.
because my reading on Guatemala is limited, well, I suppose, to urban, and it sounds like a very, very violent place, but what you're describing is sort of peaceful, tremendous bias in the way the law works, but not that much. But the people haven't been threatened. They have, no?
Yes, no, the last part that I was talking about in terms of criminalization, I mean, they face formal criminal charges, but yeah, there's death threats, there's assassination attempts, people are forced into exile. I mean, all kinds of things. Yeah, but that, it's in some way why I think people talk about continuums of racialized forms of violence, because these things have been going on for many years in Guatemala.
Well, indeed. So this violence comes from politicians, from people in the pay of the company, or some combination of the two.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, it's dangerous. But I want to query your use of the word neoliberal. I'm not in favor of neoliberalism, of course, no one is. But it seemed to me what you were talking about was positive law. I mean, that the real problem, that because you're saying that the sort of legal principles and forms of argument and rules of evidence, you don't think they really, I mean, that's not particularly neoliberal. It's the way the law works. But I've also noticed that, that you're not really talking about legal pluralism here either, are you? Because the people who are affected are going to the national court. No? They're not trying, except for the one that you participated in, but that was outside the legal system. So it's, I mean, I've noticed that, like in Colombia, there are indigenous legal systems which are recognized by the national court, and that seems to work. But here it's something slightly different. But I don't see why why in principle the people couldn't bring their case in the main, if you want to call it mainstream, in the positive legal system. Because was it that they couldn't gather the evidence, or
Let me try and answer the different questions that you're posing to me. First, on the question of neoliberalism. Yes, you're right. I mean, maybe I didn't make clearer the kind of conceptual separation, but in terms of neoliberal, that's kind of talking about consulta as part of the edifice of multicultural constitutionalism, with all of the critiques that have gone against multicultural constitutionalism as a form of neoliberal governance, right? But yes, many of the aspects about evidence, etc., it's about positive law. It's nothing specifically neoliberal about that. It's liberal, forms of law. So you're right, and I will kind of, it is more unpacked in the written version of this. On the question of legal pluralism, I mean, yes, not just the thing that the health tribunal that I participated in, but also the consultas comunitarias, these community consultation exercises that were carried out. They were argued as part of indigenous people's law, right? As part of their rights to their own forms of governance and their own legal procedures. The Constitutional Court decided in the end that everybody had a right to have those consultas, but they weren't legally binding, right? Because they couldn't set. So, there was a fudge in that sense. But so there is legal pluralism. It is endlessly contested in court, right? It's not a strong formulation like it is in Colombia, which has, recognized jurisdicción indígena. But even in Colombia, I mean, it's recognized, but you have endless battles between indigenous communities and mega projects, right? So the question is kind of in such an uneven playing field, where are you going to be able to bring leverage against those companies or government officials who are systematically violating people's rights, right? I mean, you can discuss them, and they are endlessly discussed within indigenous governance forums, but in terms of actual redress or holding to account, you go to national law and you go to international law. So, and that's what's happened here. I mean, there have been numerous, as I said, numerous attempts to ensure accountability, ensure respect for rights. This case in the Marlin mine, and one of the reasons that I decided to work on the Marlin mine. I mean, lots of my colleagues kind of said to me, why are you taking on this? Because this mine is closed. You know, why don't you work on this one or this one or this one? You know? And I think that, you know, because it was such a paradigmatic case, and because there were so many legal actions over time, that it's an important one to look at, because there's a lot of lessons that were drawn out of this that are now being deployed in current struggles against different mining companies.
Thank you. There aren't any more hands up. I don't know if there are any more questions.
Yeah, if may I jump in briefly?
Who is this?
Emiliano, sorry.
Oh, Emiliano, right.
I was wondering, Rachel, if with the more recent emphasis on biodiversity conservation and the economicization of biodiversity, also following the Dasgupta review of nature positive economy, if you see the potential for a sort of economicization of the juridification of indigenous struggles, if in a way two economic rights or economic discourses might find an institutional arena through which to translate indigenous struggles, and if you envision any risks and opportunities for that possibility.
Thanks, Emiliano. It's a really good question, and I don't know that I really have the answer to it, but apart from to say that relationship between the environmental movement and indigenous movement has been a complicated one, right? And you know, all of that literature, what is it, 20 years ago, about kind of green Indians and essentializing forms of life, etc. But I think we're at a new moment in terms of those conversations, and in terms of those, certainly those forms of strategic litigation. And in terms of the economicization of the juridification, I'm not sure, you know, I mean, certainly not in the current context in a place like Guatemala. I don't think, I mean, it's a really, really uphill struggle, just because of the kind of fast and dirty capitalism that is supported by those in power at the moment, or those that hold power. But you can see, you know, more hopeful or
Something happened.
They are listening.
You are listening?
No, I'm just joking that they are listening.
Right. Something. Rachel is having problems with her connection, obviously. Huh. What a pity. Let's give her a couple of seconds and see whether we can.
She'll come back.
Hopefully. Oh, she's gone. Maybe she needs to come back again, sort of start all over again. Fortunately, I don't know any jokes. This is when somebody has to tell a joke. I'm afraid it doesn't seem to be possible for Rachel to come back. Julie, can we pause the recording for now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have done.
Oh, there she is. Okay, she's back. Hi. Hi, Rachel. You are muted. We can't hear you, but
in the internet today, or I think it's just overload from 8 de marzo.
or the government.
No, I think, you know, my phone hasn't stopped pinging since I started. I mean, it's just the social networks are going crazy at the moment. So I think everybody's using the internet. But I'm here. So if there are any more questions, I'm not sure if there were.
No, I think that you come back in time for us to thank you again for sharing your research and work in Central America with us. Very, very interesting and very revealing presentation, and congratulations on the work that you're doing there, because I think is fantastic. And thank you all for attending today. As I said before, we usually don't have presentations in Easter, but this year we will reveal a program of talks during the Easter term so that we can get together and continue these conversations. So thank you very much, and see you next term. And thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.